Hello, everybody. Welcome to CGHE webinar 283. I'm James Robson from Oxford University, and today we'll be hearing from Professor Saumen Chattopadhyay on regulating the teacher, examining the issue of whether there are any alternatives to regulation. This is the second webinar in our series on the critical economics of higher education, where we're aiming to start to discuss new thinking about the economics of HE and hear from speakers who are unsatisfied with the economic policy frameworks currently in use and determined to find and apply better alternatives. Now, Saumen has been a faculty member of the Zakir Hussain Center for Educational Studies at JNU since 2004. At present, he is the chairperson of the center. He did his PhD on the Black economy in India at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at JNU in 2002. And earlier, he worked at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy in New Delhi. His research areas include economics of education, focusing particularly on policymaking in higher education, and public finance, specializing in the areas of tax evasion and tax compliance. His recent book, entitled Changing Higher Education in India, co-edited with Professor Marginson and Professor Varghese, has very recently been published by Bloomsbury. Now, before I hand over to Saumen, there are some brief housekeeping points to mention. So this webinar is being recorded and will be posted online on the CGHE website tomorrow morning. A transcript of the chat function conversation will be posted. Please keep yourself muted unless you've been asked to speak or ask a question. There's no need to have your video on during the webinar, but please do so when asking a question. We recommend using the speaker view so you can more clearly see who's talking. To ask a question, use the chat function and write out the question you wish to ask. At the end of the presentation, if your question is selected, you'll be invited to ask it yourself directly. And when invited to ask a question, please unmute yourself, switch on your video and state your name and where you're from. Now, I'll pass over to Saumen for today's webinar. So Saumen, over to you.
So thank you very much, James, for your kind introduction. And at the very beginning, I must express my deep gratitude to you for giving me the opportunity to share my understanding of the area that I'm interested in. And of course, I would like to thank Professor Marginson for giving me this platform, which is highly prestigious and coveted. So let me begin. Let me share the screen. Yeah, is it, I think it's visible to everybody. Right, James? Yeah, fine.
Yeah, I can see it. It's not in presentation mode. I don't know if you want to put it in. Oh, there we go.
No,
perfect.
It's fine. Okay. What I intend to present before you today, there are two aspects of it. First of all, I would like to deal with the fact that why economic principles are invoked to understand the dynamics of the education sector. Particularly, I'll be focusing on the higher education sector and why the economic principles are informing policymaking. And second, I would try to link it up with the transformation that we are witnessing in the Indian context. The National Education Policy 2020 was announced in July 2020, and a series of regulations are in the process of being framed and being process of implementation. And we would like to look at particularly the role of teacher in the context of the National Education Policy 2020. So there are two parts of my presentation. I would spend half the time on economics of education. Can we apply economic principles to understand the higher education sector? Even if it can be, should we? And then I would move on to unravel the economic rationale behind higher education policy making. And in the second part of my presentation, I'd be dealing with how the national education policy has diagnosed the challenges the Indian higher education sector is faced with. And particularly, I'll not be dealing with the entire higher education sector. I'll be dealing with only the regulation part, which pertains to the teachers. Now, as most of you are aware of, even if it's a repetition, I would go over it. The theoretical foundation of economics of education can be traced to the human capital theory. It is important for us to remember that the propositions, the implications of the propositions are very significant for the education sector and how we, the students and the teachers, behave in the domain of education. And the first proposition is the student is an investor. Second, the student is faced with the alternative opportunities which are comparable to an investor in the capital market. And the guiding principle for the student to invest in education is the return maximization, which is very similar to an investor in the capital market, in the financial market. Now, if we look at 2 and 3, therefore, we find that education has not been given any special importance compared to all other sectors, right? So it is tantamount to the degradation of education, the very purpose of education and what education can do for us and the society. And the second subdiscipline of economics of education, the human capital theory, is the application of the educational production function or input-output modeling, which seeks to establish a relationship between the input, the teachers and the students, who are the self-optimizing inputs, with what we do in the class and in the laboratories, the teaching and research and outreach activity. Now, economics of education, sadly speaking, is hardly offered in a majority of the departments of economics in the Indian universities as an optional paper. And in the schools of education, departments of education, it is also ignored. Generally, in the economics department, what happens, the important areas of economics of education are covered in public finance and development economics or welfare economics. So it is taken care of. But when it comes to the teaching of economics of education in the education department, it evokes a kind of mixed response. Particularly, it invites criticism, saying that the economists tend to commodify education, which is not at all acceptable, and therefore we don't want to offer economics of education in the education department. However, what I would like to argue, that despite there's a world of difference between the commodity production and the domain of education, the universities and the colleges, we can have very important insight which can enrich our understanding of the world of education. And the application of human capital theory has been criticized from many perspectives: sense capability approach, the signaling theory, and within human capital theory, you have a very severe critique on the basis of the argument that the social reality is very complex, very layered. It's a nonlinear system, it's an open system, and highly heterogeneous. So therefore, the mainstream economics, which is the foundation of the human capital theory, cannot deal with this complexity. And therefore, it doesn't do justice to what we actually witness in the reality. In addition, when the students form their expectation about the future, they have to have some expectations. And expectations at the end of the day are very subjective. So therefore, estimation of the rate of return itself becomes a meaningless exercise, apart from the critique that the two domains of education and work are not necessarily linked. So therefore, establishing a link between the domain of education and work is something far-fetched. And then there's another argument that it's a power policy nexus, and the policymakers have invoked economics of education in the policy making for education, which has affected the education. Now, how can we gain from economics of education when you're dealing with the higher education sector? I would like to take I'd like to deal with three issues here, which are apparently puzzling, but actually not if we appeal to the basic understanding that we gain from economics of education. The first is that, and these are in the context of India, not necessarily true for the developed country. Let me put it very frankly at the very beginning. Why does there exist poor quality higher education institutions, despite informed, to a large extent, of course, choice making by the students within a competitive higher education system? In a commodity setup, we would expect that the firms which are producing bad quality goods or rendering bad quality services would leave the market or would be compelled to leave the market, right? But in education, it doesn't happen. Or I can put it somewhat differently, why competition fails to improve quality, or even if it can improve quality, only up to a limited extent. The second, if higher education is a public good and the market fails, it follows from basic economics, why is it the case that private participation is rising? And the third is the privatization, at least I can tell you in the context of our country, though there are pockets of excellence both in the private sector as well as in the public sector, but overall, privatization has not led to an improvement in the quality of education. Now, in order to answer or in order to address some of these apparently puzzling statements, what we gain from economics of education is that the world of commodity production and the world of education, there are quite a good number of mismatches. That means the economic principles cannot be readily applied in the domain of education. I'm just mentioning some of these things, but I need not relate with the three statements that I made with some of these this insight that we gain from economics of education. First of all, if we make a distinction between teaching and research, then there cannot be a full-fledged market for higher education. And market cannot function and should not function. Basically, we should have a quasi-market for education because autonomy cannot be given to the students and the institutions in order to safeguard the interest of education and those who are from the margin of the society and the quality of education. Second, the competition, the nature of competition in a higher education market is very different. It is a selection-based competition in addition to what we have exchange-based competition in a typical commodity market. In education market, both these competition, the selection-based competition and exchange-based competition coexist. The next is the education is not a typical commodity with well-defined specification. It is essentially an experience good, and that makes quite a lot of difference when we are dealing with economics of education with respect to particularly higher education. Students are not typically the consumers. They cannot buy the degrees. They have to earn their degrees. So no matter we marketize and treat the students as consumers, we need to remember that learning in the class and research in the lab are actually co-produced. And therefore, treating the students as consumers to improve quality is not a very good idea. At least in India, I can tell you that the students in the majority of the universities are more interested in the degrees and the certificate that they can get so that they become eligible for entering the job market with the qualifications, instead of going through the rigorous process of learning. So the screening, education as a screening device is an alternative to human capital theory, which is very much prevalent in the context of India, and that leads to poor quality of what we do. Optimization, either cost cutting given output or output maximization given cost, is good for the firm, but is not good for the university or a college, because they are both inimical to quality education. And cost and quality are actually positively related. Though there are umpteen number of studies to empirically estimate the educational production function, but it is unstable and weak, and there is no well-defined technology. It's very difficult to deal with when the students and the teachers are both optimizing agents. The next point is interesting, that because the quality of human capital is embodied in us, it cannot be manufactured indefinitely. That means they are not replicable. The way you can manufacture n number of times the chip or any other product because of the technology, it doesn't happen for economics education. Hypothetically speaking, if an international branch campus of Oxford University is located in Delhi, one cannot get the Oxford University of Oxford in Delhi in this IBC of Oxford University. But if the Nikon, a camera manufacturing unit from Japan, sets up a shop in the outskirts of Delhi, you get the same quality of camera that you get otherwise if you had to buy in Tokyo itself. The theory of production and cost, they are not tenable. You can apply the way you apply for a firm, and that has got serious implication because it can hamper the functioning of the university as an institution, and ultimately one can end up with compromising with the university objective. And public-private divide is a policy construct. It has to be understood within a particular context, socio-political, economic context, right? So some of these insight, if you can, we can invoke some of these to understand why the world of higher education is somewhat different from the commodity. Now, when you're looking at these very economic principles, which are not necessarily applicable for the world of education, are actually being invoked to inform the policymaking based on neoliberal approach, right? So the reason is why and what we can do about it. I'll just take the two examples, Adam Smith in his Wealth of Nations, 1776, and James Buchanan, co-authored with Devletoglu, Academia in Anarchy in 1970. Both of them argued that it is the absence of market which could explain the failure or the suboptimal functioning of the universities. That means if you have the market, which would install accountability mechanism, then the quality of education delivered by the universities would improve. But this entails that the teachers and the students to behave very differently, but in practice, it is not so. So the entire neoliberal approach to policymaking is something like this, that they believe that they accept that there are indeed sources of market failure, but the sources of market failure can be corrected by designing suitable policy. And there are instances of government failure, but the government failure cannot necessarily be corrected because the underlying assumption is that the teachers or the agents in a principal agent model are self-interest driven homo economicus, and therefore, if you cannot change their behavior, better to manipulate the teachers and students to obtain the desirable solution. So the market failure can be corrected and a new state-regulated market can be constructed, whereas the government failure cannot be corrected because of this assumption that the teachers and students are essentially self-interest driven individual, and so therefore they don't behave in a manner they are expected to behave when in the field of education. In the neoliberal, there are two different strands that we obtain. One is the market construction to achieve allocational efficiency, and the other is the NPM, new public management-based university governance, to achieve technical efficiency. So to strike a balance between that we can have public funding as well as the market construction, that means the public funding need not necessarily be channeled to the universities, but the students can be funded with the voucher system. So the market is constructed and the government continues to fund education. That's the new approach, that public funding would exist, at the same time market is constructed. So when you are looking at the entire shift in higher education reform based on neoliberal principle, we are just going to focus on the teacher here, because the teacher is central to the functioning of the higher education institution. So if we can understand how the teachers and the students are being dealt with in the policy, we'll be able to understand what is the overall approach to higher education reform. Now, in a traditional concept of university, the teachers are expected to behave in a particular manner. And this is what the neoliberals contest. And let me then tell you how the teacher is expected to behave. The teacher should have the freedom of inquiry, which is essential for knowledge generation and disinterested pursuit of truth. The teacher should remain intrinsically motivated. And based on Fege and others, it is argued that monitoring and surveillance actually crowd out the intrinsic motivation, and therefore the teachers would cease to be intrinsically motivated if you have monitoring and surveillance. The teacher should be trustworthy. So therefore, when you're moving from the traditional input-based public funding to neoliberal approach to higher education policy reform, we are actually shifting from high trust to a low trust system. And then what I obtained from the literature, the teacher should have the competence, and that is absolutely prerequisite, should exhibit scholarly diligence and morally responsible. The teacher should remain accountable to her conscience. Then teacher should have a sense of duty or accountable to multiple sources. But of course, when you have giving autonomy to the teachers and you are banking on the teachers are intrinsically motivated to deliver to their potential best, what is important here that the funding should be directed to the input of the universities so that there is no interference with what the teachers do. But if these conditions are not obtained, the neoliberals enter to fix the system. So the suboptimal performance of the university has been made attributable to the suboptimal performance of the teachers. Essentially, it is argued that the teachers are self-interested. In fact, once in the course of the discussion, my supervisor, Professor Arun Kumar, once said that we are no different. We just happen to be teachers, and that continues to resonate. The new public management suggests that the teachers' performance should be accounted and they should be subject to audit. And then, the other condition you are aware of, you have to achieve efficiency, get the value for money the society demands. And the market is the best institution because it gives freedom to choose and fosters competition to realize efficiency. And though the neoliberals, some of them would argue that efficiency leads to an improvement in quality, but the link between efficiency attainment and the delivery of quality is actually uncertain. There is no guarantee that efficiency would lead to quality. So what we find that when we apply economic principles to usher in reform in the higher education sector, the teachers, students, and the universities, they evolve. The students become consumers. If the students are made to feel that they are paying for their high fees by borrowing money from the bank, they actually tend to behave as investors. The teacher ceases to be intrinsically motivated when the trust is not reposed and there's a monitoring and surveillance and auditing and accounting, and then higher education institutions evolve as corporates. In the process, what happens? The public good character of higher education gets compromised because of this growing individualization in the society. And if you give priority to the market construction, where the money and the merit get priorities at the expense of margin, then we are going to build up a society with limited access to the people hailing from the marginal section of the society, and it will lead to an inequitable society. So this is what I wanted to share with you about the concern about economics of education, its utility, and why we should be very critical when we are applying economic principles to the domain of education, right? And if we understand that why economic principles are not necessarily applicable to the domain of education, then when the policies are so designed based on economic principles, it would be easier for us to know how we can rectify if something is happening which is undesirable. Since I'm moving to the Indian context now, and I would like to see that how the national education policy has been framed, and what is the role of the teacher and what we can do about it. So this is an Indian context, but since some of you may or may not be acquainted with the Indian higher education system, I would have some discussion on the Indian higher education. Generally, it is considered to be the second or third largest in the world. 1,000 odd universities, students around 38 million, teachers 1.4 million. Gross enrollment rate would be around 28%, and 2/3 of the enrollment scattered to by the enrollment in the private, aided and unaided. Quality is a major concern, the poor employability of the graduates, and very limited presence of the Indian universities in the global ranking. As a percentage of GDP, if we take all the ministries, including Ministry of Education and other ministries, we are spending around 4.4% of GDP. Students' mobility, there are two estimates. If we look at the UNESCO latest data, 461,000, but Ministry of External Affairs in a reply said it's around 0.8 million. It's the second most important sending country for students abroad after China. But if you look at the publication, that is very important, that how we are doing in terms of our publication, we see that if we look the international facts and figures, Universities UK International 2020 publication, India was 4th in the list after China, USA, and UK. And the 5th was Germany. But if we look at the total number of teachers, which is around 1.4 million, and the publication, which is around 0.18 million, then we find that around 100 faculty are producing 11 to 12 publications per year, which is on the much lower side. Co-authored publication is also slower. National education policy is a blend of two objectives. One is a objective about inculcation of value, self-formation and all. And at the same time, there is a distinct thrust towards skill, imparting of skill. I will not go into the details of all these things, but I'm just giving you an overall idea before I come to the role of the teacher. It is important to understand why, how the challenges that you are facing in India have been diagnosed by the national education policy, the draft and the final version. Because if we can understand the diagnosis, then only we can understand why the policies are being recommended, the rationale behind it, and how they are going to address the challenges that we are faced with. Some of the challenges mentioned by the national education policy is that there has to be a focus on skill orientation, internationalization, and both these things are going to be realized by adopting technology, the digitization of the system. It has recognized that higher education is a quasi-public good, so public funding has to go up to 6% of GDP from the present 4.3% in the course of the next 10 years. What is important for this particular presentation is that the draft of the national education policy said that there are too many higher education institutions, and the sizes of these institutions are too small, mostly are of substandard quality. Now, why substandard quality? It's because of the suboptimal utilization of the resources, human, financial, and physical. And before we talk about financial and physical, the human resources, the suboptimal utilization of the human resources would be at the center. Further, it said that there is a lack of vibrancy. Teachers are indolent or lackadaisical. Their approach, lack of enthusiasm among the teachers and the students, and the regulation has failed to deliver. There's a micromanagement which has stifled the teachers to innovate both in teaching and research. The draft also said that the faculties did indulge in unethical practices, and there's a lack of compliance, and promotion was largely based on the seniority, proliferation of the fake journals, and emergence of an inspectorial regime. And this micromanagement of practices led to the suffocation of the teachers in what they wanted to do, which means that their academic freedom that they're supposed to exercise in teaching and research got circumscribed by this micromanagement of these regulatory practices. And there are, of course, vacant faculty positions and inadequate infrastructure. The solution is that the teachers should be subject to regulation, which should be light, but tightly enforced. That means the limited number of regulation, but it has to be very tightly enforced. One important dimension is that the leadership. The leadership is very, very important because the universities are supposed to make strategies in the highly competitive scenario. And now, because of internationalization, we are in the global scenario now. Some of the universities have been accorded the status of institutions of eminence. And for the category 1 institution, also, we are part of the global now, right? And so therefore, the leadership question is very, very important. What I would like to focus on is the institutional development plan. Institutional development plan is a strategy, is a plan which has been recommended by the University Grants Commission, and how universities can plan and what would be the role of the teachers in that particular context. Now, when the national education policy is very critical of the failure of regulation, we need to understand, we need to deal, we need to spend some time on why the UGC regulation failed to deliver quality and why, therefore, the national education policy became critical of the failure of regulation. That means they failed to regulate the teachers and extract the best possible from the teachers in their teaching and research. It was long ago, Professor Allback and Jawaharlal said, they spent some time on why the promotion system in India actually failed. It had unethical practices, and it did not incentivize the teachers at all to do well, excel, and deliver. The promotion was mostly based on seniority, but now let us come to the UGC regulation. UGC regulation, it was adopted first in 2010, and it was said that, for the benefit of the international audience, the pay scale are determined by the pay commission recommendation of the universities, university colleges and teachers. So the increment that we get every year, which is 3% of our basic pay, is almost the same for all the teachers in the colleges and universities, right? And it is an input-based system. So there's not much variation in what we earn. Possibly there would be some variation compared to a central university and the state university, because state university often is faced with fiscal constraint and they cannot implement the pay scale in its full. And so therefore there would be, but on paper, therefore, the pay commission recommendations are strictly followed, right? And the increment is given. So you have to understand the autonomy that we have in terms of, and the negotiation, we don't have to deal with any HR department in any university college. Now, the UGC regulation was actually adopted. It was argued that when the administrative officials and when the teachers in colleges or universities are paid at par, there's no discrepancy between what they are being paid and what we are being paid. Why shouldn't the UGC be asking us, what is your performance? How have you performed? Whether we are indeed eligible for career promotion, and when it comes to the recruitment of the faculty, how they are going to be regulated. So in the UGC regulation, what we have is a very strict guideline. So we are supposed to score points based on our research, what is called the research score. And then there's a mention of the teaching load and research guidance. We have to teach so many number of hours. We have to spend 1 hour per week minimum for our research student doing PhD under our supervision. And then how the journals are ranked, and depending on the impact factor, how the points are awarded to the faculty for their publication in the journals. All these details are there in the UGC regulation. The problem is when the teachers are given a target, they have to achieve the target within a given period of time. And if there exist many different ways of achieving the target, depending on the competence of the teacher and the time to be taken to achieve the target, generally the teacher would choose the optimal path. And that optimal path for achieving the target within a given period of time need not lead to quality publication. And that is the crux of the problem. So in the UGC regulation further, it's a 2018 regulation, we have extra points to be awarded to the faculty for developing e-content or for MOOCs, incentives for research project measured in terms of funding, no incentive for better performances. It is called minimum regulation, and the division of points for co-authored publication. But overall, if you look at it, then you find that the teacher's self-esteem somewhat high, because there is a lack of trust reposed on the teacher, as if the entire draft has been designed based on the fact that teachers are not indeed trustworthy. So they have to be regulated in terms of the courses, research guidance time, publication, and everything. Publication is understandable, but the use of time is something very, very restrictive. And that led to the proliferation of the journals. But the corruption in academic has been pointed out by many. Nepotism, poor quality teaching, poor leadership. And then I have also discussed in my paper that there exists a wide range of activities which are actually corrupt. But on paper, you can't really say it is corrupt. But these activities, when they exhibit a lack of effort or some kind of compromise with the scholarship, they can be defined as corrupt practices. Because the education process is like this, they are easily amenable to manipulation and subversion. Appointment of the VC is also a matter of political decision, particularly in the state government. And so if you look at the entire UGC regulation, then there is a very clear message which comes up. It says that there is a complete disregard for the differences in the university's mandate, because the same regulation would be applied for all the universities, irrespective of the discipline, irrespective of the differences in the universities and the individual differences, right? But UGC has also responded. There's a regulation for plagiarism, for checking plagiarism. UGC has brought out a dynamic list of the listed journals where we are supposed to publish and earn points. But this, the rapid rise in the number of publications has come with a cost. Now, in my last part of the presentation, I'll be just focusing on only one aspect of the national education policy, where I believe the teachers have been given some space, some scope to exercise their autonomy and how it could be better improved. So I'm not going into the entire regulatory framework. I'm just looking at this particular paragraph, which I picked up from the institutional development plan. The universities and colleges are supposed to prepare, and this would be used for public funding. It recognizes the importance of the institutional development plan and recommend that each institution should make a strategic institutional development plan. We shall be prepared, and this is the interesting part, we shall be prepared with the joint participation of the board members, institutional leaders, faculty, students, and the staff to develop initiative, assess their progress and the reach goals, and therefore, this is what is going to be used for public funding. Now, what is appealing here, there is a collective. The teachers and the students and the staff all are supposed to gather, discuss, and envisage. And this is where the interesting part is. And this collective reflection or collective envisaging of the future has to be done in the context of the SWOT analysis, which should be undertaken by the university. So this collective planning will involve all the stakeholders. And this is important, but we need to understand that the funding is going to be very, very competitive. It's not that that whatever we plan will be funded, given the fact the universities and the colleges have been assured of financial autonomy. And this financial autonomy, that means we can now mobilize or garner resources from other sources. They may interfere with our exercise of autonomy in the academic sphere, because every time we design a course, we need to understand that the fees have to be cost recovery in nature. So when the universities are actually competing with hundreds of other universities, given the fact that the funding is limited, it can as well happen that the autonomy which is being given to the teachers may not actually fructify. So this institutional development plan appears to me very different from a typical new public management practice. And this is where I believe that there can be a scope where the teachers can be given to exercise more freedom. Now, what I'm asking for, that true, the teachers have been given the space to build up collegiality within the faculty, within the department, within the university, is a collective planning in the future. All these are very good things. But I was thinking that whether, and this issue was actually talked about in the course of the UGC regulation implementation in my university long ago, that whether every teacher can be given the freedom to decide her template of deliverables. That means each teacher would be given the freedom to decide how the teacher would utilize the time given the resources to teach, offer new courses, to do research, and how to engage in outreach activities. Now, when the universities are performing, this bottom-up approach may not enable the universities to compete effectively with other universities. So what can happen if there is a mismatch? Then the faculty, the university authority can sit together and deal with these mismatches, and the senior professors can take the lead so that ultimately the freedom is given. It's a bottom-up approach, but at the same time, university is going to deliver what is required to remain competitive in the condition. And this would need capability formation. This would need liberal funding. And as Prakash Chandra, Pankaj Chandra has argued that you cannot ask for accountability if you do not give autonomy to the teachers. So that autonomy is absolutely essential to give us a collective sense of pride, self-esteem, and to behave in a responsible manner so that ultimately we deliver. Now, I would like to stop here, James, because I've taken more than 20 minutes. If there are questions, then I can proceed. Otherwise, I would like to stop here.
Well, thank you, Saumen. It's a fantastic presentation, and I think what you've done is really highlight nicely the relationship here between sort of broad economic thinking and how that gets played out in the specific policy context of India. And the complexity of the Indian context is really really interesting here, that it sheds such an important light on how these nuanced economic approaches play out. So colleagues, I think now's the time to come in with questions. We've got one in the chat already from Glenn. So Glenn, perhaps would you like to come in with your question about the public good?
Yes. Sorry, my visual is not very good, but let me take a chance at commending Professor Saumen for his very, very elucidating and very edifying presentation. However, I kind of got this feeling that your argument is veering away from education as a public good. You know, and you made a pretty good points showing that how the value of education itself right now has become so degraded or deroded, if you will. And are you pivoting towards the bias of failure? And how would you then argue back, all right, against the position of my question to you? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Glenn. can I take this question, James? Yeah.
Yes, please do.
Okay, okay. It's a very good question, and the questions actually give me the opportunity to clarify in case I created some confusion in the course of my presentation. So thank you very much. You see, the publicness of higher education or the public good character of higher education are generated when we, the graduates, teachers and the students, behave in a manner which foster the tendencies which would hold the society together or democratic functioning of the institutions. That means our conduct, our behavior in every sphere of life is very, very important. And that is where the public good character of higher education lies. Now, unless we are transformed, we cannot generate those externalities. So the transformation of the self is very important. So what I was trying to argue, that if you move towards this new liberal kind of policy making, and this is nothing new, it is already there in the literature, that the students are made to feel as investors, and the teachers are made to feel that they are getting individualized, and they are made to feel that, you know, they're getting somewhat aloof or alienated from the society, then both the teachers and the students fail to generate that kind of externalities. Now, what is the way out? The way out is, I look at it from the funding perspective. The funding perspective is that high fee is not a solution for a country like India because of the increasing number of first generation learners. So the public funding, which has been assured for long, has to be there. In fact, National Education Policy did mention about the raising of budgetary allocation for education, but it has not happened. It depends on how the government prioritizes the education and health compared to all other sectors. So what is necessary, therefore, that what I was trying to argue, that give us the freedom to deliver and give us the requisite resources to operate and function, which are absolutely essential now, right? It starts with the library books to the basic necessities that we need to do our research. And then ask accountability, then ask for accountability, and let us see that whether we can deliver. And then the students and the teachers, if there is a public funding, then the students automatically behave in a responsible manner. They feel that they are being funded. It's very important. When they are paying full fees and the kind of responsibility that they're supposed to exhibit, I find that somewhat diminished. And this is where, therefore, without public funding, without autonomy, you cannot rejuvenate the system. The neoliberal is like allopathic medicine. You know, the disease might be cured on paper, but there will be a lot of adverse side effect. This is what I was trying to argue. I don't know whether I've answered your question, but this is what I was trying to argue. Thank you.
Thanks, Saumen. Thanks, Glenn. I'll bring in Vincent at this point. Vincent, do you want to come on?
Can you see me?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi. Many thanks, Saumen. Really good to see you, and thanks for a fascinating talk. So I've got two questions. Probably both of them are quite big, but one is about like your first part of your presentation, which is about the space for economics of education in studies, and I share your idea that we need to know about economics if we work in education or higher education, and that means to learn about it critically as well. So I was very interested in your idea of like teaching economics of education, in connection with other social sciences. So I'm not asking you like a pedagogy but how do you connect those different social sciences? And I think it's about teaching, but it's also about like you made some really good comment about the way policymakers use selectively disciplines as well. So how do you make those interdisciplinary connections in some ways? The second question is very big. I was just like thinking in terms of system and what you have in India, public funding, the teachers' communities. I had an S here because I'd like to know whether institutional differentiation, the difference between the various kind of institution, has an impact on the mechanism you described. So in the future, do you see like system in India more segmented, more institutional differentiation, or
Okay. Yeah.
on the contrary? Thank you.
Thank you. James, can I take the question now? Okay, thanks, Vincent. The first question is that, let me share with you that UGC has indeed taken some step to develop course, what is called social sector economics, education and health put together. Right? There are some initiatives to teach economics of education. Surprisingly, economics of health, if you visit the library, you will find many books. And economics of health is taught in many universities here. But when it comes to economics of education, it's not actually taught, it's spread over the other things. So what I can tell you that very often, because of the existence of the education department, when our PhD students enter the job market after doing research in the economics of education, they're asked that, so you are from economics, why did you do your PhD in the field of education? What was there? The same question is not asked if the student did PhD in health, but if they have done their PhD in education, they draw parallel and say that, why did you shift to education? As if there is no need for economics in education, but there is indeed a need for economics when it comes to health. This is the kind of problem which exists when it comes to, and particularly higher education as a field of study is also not offered in the Department of Education. In many departments, there was some initiative by NUPA to do this. The second part is the institutional differentiation, and it's a very relevant question for India. See, when you are talking about access, when the institutions are getting increasingly differentiated, one is, it is very much intrinsic to the functioning of the higher education system because of the selection-based efficiency, that there will be always a concentration of the human capital, the best of them, among the best of the universities up on the hierarchy. So the hierarchy is getting entrenched. And second, there is a policy-induced part. National education policy has really talked about research-intensive university, teaching-intensive university, and then autonomous degree-granting colleges. Now, if you allow competition among them, that they can climb up the ladder only by doing research, and you are categorizing in terms of their teaching and research load, and given the fact that there will be only one body, National Research Foundation, to disburse grant to all these three kinds of institutions, I am tempted to think that the research-intensive universities will be getting more funds. So it will be increasingly difficult for the teaching-intensive university and the degree-granting colleges actually to compete, fight out, and climb up the ladder of education hierarchy, right? So that will also be interfering. So with the autonomy and how they see their career in the future. So what is important here, therefore, the differentiation is very much there, and the differentiation is going to be accentuated, either by regulation, which I did not talk about, what is called the graded autonomy, institutions of eminence, and when you have got the foreign universities coming in, it is going to be a highly competitive situation, and the competition means more and more differentiation, right? So this is, I would like to answer.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to say. Then you have question from Anu.
Yes, let's bring Anu here.
Anu, do you see any possibility of higher education in India breaking free from the mediocrity courtesy, the new education policy? Most faculty members are homegrown, but we aspire for better ranks globally. Isn't this a contradiction itself? There are a lot of changes in the graded autonomy and rooted in the graded autonomy. And in the new UGC circular also, that you have the faculty member from industry, from international universities, the top 500 ranked universities, they can come and teach here. So, and there are other two programs by the government of India to promote international. The foreign scholars come and deliver lecture here. And our visit is also funded under a program called Spark, possibly. So, so what the government has done, that all universities cannot compete globally. So the universities are being categorized. So some universities will have the freedom, category 1 and institution of eminence, to compete globally, garner more resources, and they will have the freedom to strategize so that they do well in terms of the ranking. The others need not be. It's not mentioned, but if you regulate others and do not give adequate fund to others, what I fear that this high degree of competition will actually create more differences within the system. So the admission of the students should be merit-based, is mentioned in the graded autonomy. But tell me how difficult it will be for us to deviate from the admission policy of the university, which is very inclusive and gives a lot of priority to the students from the different sections of the society. It's very difficult. So it's on paper, for example, a category 1 institution can deviate, but in practice it cannot. So what you find here, that some universities, institution of eminence and all, they will have the freedom, but other universities would not have, and therefore all universities need not compete globally as well. So there are some steps, therefore, so that some universities can compete globally, but overall it's not feasible, and therefore they have to do what they can do the best.
Thank you, Saumen.
Question from
I'll bring
George.
in George. Are you on screen, George?
Yeah, are you there?
I am.
Excellent.
I'm Jorge. So hello everybody from the university.
Thank you.
So thank you. It's very thought-provoking presentation, and I'm concerned about what sometimes we see higher education framed and shaped by a current economics model that shapes institutions promoting in research in certain ways. And I am concerned about what if we should be thinking a little bit more, for example, that we measure or we determine the importance or the relevance of a professor or somebody in the academic profession by the number of index publications, instead of looking for new ways to look at the purpose, how higher education is changing or what the society is asking from us, if we think of higher education. So what do you think about that? And thank you for the opportunity to ask you.
No, that's a good question. And in India, what is happening, the best of the institutions measured in terms of some NAAC score, the quality assurance score that the universities are awarded with, and 20 odd institutions of eminence, the status they have been accorded with, they are supposed to strategize to do well in terms of the ranking parameters. Now, when the ranking parameters do not give enough importance or do not give any importance at all to the public good character of education and how the education can link up with the society in various other ways, then naturally the very tussle that exists between how do you do well in terms of ranking and at the same time, how do you connect with the society through various outreach activities, there will be a trade-off. And this trade-off is very, very important. So what is being done here, that only the top universities are supposed to do well in terms of the ranking parameters. And the ranking parameters, THE, QS, and ARWU. Right? ARWU, Shanghai Jiatong, TH, and QS are for the institutions of eminence, and THE and QS are for the category 1 graded universities. So there is a slight difference. So these universities are being made to rank, and I personally feel that the best of the universities, if they are orienting them for competing in the global arena in terms of the ranking parameters designed by agencies which are outside the country, and they may or may not be bothered about how we can contribute to the society, then there is a problem. So the remaining universities are therefore supposed to connect better with the society. Though there are major improvements, major changes, major revision in the ranking parameters to ensure that the universities connect better with the society is being set as a target for them. But as of now, the university-wise ranking parameters do not reflect enough concern for the outreach activities and how therefore they can take care of the public good character of education. As of now, there are a lot of changes happening which I may or may not be able to deal with directly. So that's a problem. In fact, when you're measuring the faculty also, what are the parameters? Those parameters are also very, very important. How these parameters are guiding our allocation of time, teaching and research and outreach activity. So the setting the parameters and the weights that we are assigning to the publication, teaching and outreach activity would actually be guiding our allocation of time and therefore how we are going to connect with the society. So this is very, very important, whether we are talking about the UGC regulation parameters or the ranking parameters. Unless they are properly designed, then the connection between the university and the society may suffer diminution over time. That has to be taken care of. Yes, I don't know whether I could answer your question. Thank you, nevertheless. Yes.
Well, thank you, Saumen, and thank you all for your excellent questions. I think we've reached 3 o'clock here, so we probably better bring this session to a close. It leaves me to say thank you so much for a fantastic presentation, Saumen. A really enjoyable conversation, and we look forward to seeing you soon on another webinar, we hope.
Thank you.
Now, this is, as I said, the second of a series of 4 webinars. Our next one will be on Thursday, led by Moses Okech, who will be talking about finance models in sub-Saharan Africa. So we hope to see you there. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.